All right, folks, if you want to take a seat, we'll get the show on the road. So welcome to our, what is it, October already? Just a couple of years have flown by. October meeting, and tonight we have a couple of my compatriots here talking about Java CMS. So hopefully it's of interest to everybody who's here. And I think without any ado, we'll go ahead and get started. Just as an FYI, in case people are interested in speaking just in general about topics, some cool technology that you played with. And I'm actually also thinking of putting together maybe another one of those little like 30-minute talks, like 2 or 3 talks, that people just want to chat about some tools or something like that. Let me know. I don't think I have a speaker for November yet. And I might actually even cancel the November meetup because the third Tuesday usually ends up being like really close to Thanksgiving. Yeah, if anybody's interested, reach out to me, nimmer.nimmer.com. It's all online and all that stuff. And we can always do something like early next year, obviously. So as always, I'd like to thank Disney for this great space they've hosted us for the last, 1.5 years, 2 years or something like that. And then, as always, Tech Systems for the pizza. So thank you. And then thanks, George, for videotaping this. It's going to be online probably by the weekend or something like that. And thank you, everyone, for coming. So just as a side note, we'll probably head over for drinks after the beers after the meeting here. So if you're interested, hang around. Sazerac, it's about a block down that way. Let's see, jobs. So let's jump right into the jobs thing. Just out of curiosity, anybody looking for a job right now? Okay, so there's a couple of people. Excellent, great. So people looking to hire people. We'll work our way this way. So Mackenzie.
Yeah, I actually brought my counterpart, Megan, today. I know normally I focus mostly in the Java space at Tech Systems, but I brought Megan along with me as well. She's been a recruiter at Tech for over a year now, and I just thought it would be nice to have somebody a little bit more senior, kind of give the Tech Systems spiel.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Again, pizza in the back if you guys want to get up and get some everyone's talking. I focus a little bit more in the data sector, but we really just focus on IT staffing. We're the nation's leading IT staffing and services company. Work with companies throughout our whole region, Disney, Starbucks, Microsoft, T-Mobile, everyone. So please feel free to come speak with us afterwards. We can give you our cards, meet up later to talk in further detail. I'm happy to help any way we can.
All right, thank you, ladies. So working our way this way. Yes.
Hi, my name is Sharman. I'm a lead engineer at a small company called The Platform doing online video management. We're always looking for senior level Java engineers to do some pretty complicated SOA video management systems. We just opened up 25 new heads. So if you're interested in working on video, come talk to me.
Cool. And you guys still part of Comcast? Or?
We are still part of Comcast.
Okay, cool. That's cool. Malia.
Hello, I'm Malia, and I work with Dev9, the same company as the speakers tonight. We're a consulting firm, and we focus on continuous delivery and custom software development around web services and web applications. And we actually have several opportunities open right now. We have some teams that are just launching in Seattle, as well as some new teams starting that we're hosting in our Kirkland office. The types of engagements can vary within the web services and web applications realm, but the opportunities are pretty interesting. So if you're open to chatting with me, I'd love to.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay. Any pieces of news, any information, anything for the group? The year's kind of winding down. Just out of curiosity, like how many people are using Java 8 and pretty much just Java 8? Or are using Java 8 just in general? Wow. So Java 7, is that what everybody else is on?
Unfortunately.
Huh, interesting. And 8's been out, what?
Clients forcing us to use Java 7.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. Anything else? Any other questions? Anybody else want to hold a group about anything? I know the mailing list is pretty much dead these days, except for the occasional flame war or something. Maybe I should post another ID thing on there or something like that. Get some conversation going. All right, cool. Well, I guess with that, I'll hand it off to David and Gabe. we'll talk about Hippo.
Hi, good evening. My name is David Drake. I used to be a middle school teacher for about a year down in Shoreline. It was the year that they first started giving laptops to every single student in the class. You guys ever hear about that? Every kid had a MacBook, and every one of those MacBooks had iChat installed on it. And they didn't tell us, the teachers, that was what the case was. So for the first 2 or 3 months, the teachers were just constantly trying to fight to get people to look up from their screens right in front of them, until eventually you got used to the whole lids down when you start. I'm not going to make you guys do that, but just looking at a sea of laptops out in front of me kind of reminds me of that. Kind of gives me the old fear. I guess to get started, how many of you have actually used Hippo ever? Is there a single hand? That means I can make up anything I want tonight, right? All right. It's a great Scottish dragon. Have you at least heard of it? No. Some of you. Okay. What CMSs are you folks using? Raise your hand. Or just call out. Yeah.
I have used Alfresco in the past extensively.
Alfresco?
Alfresco and Drupal.
Drupal. How'd you guys like Alfresco?
It's terrible.
Terrible?
It's painful.
Painful? Drupal?
I found the operating system a little bit
Oh. Okay.
I used to be a developer at .cms.
Which one?
.cms.
.cms? Okay.
Yeah, and I have a bias. I have bias to say, oh, it works well. Yeah, I did it.
What's it written on? Is it pretty easy to use?
For me, yes, because I know all the internals. So for me, going to the backend was really easy. But actually, the extensibility I think is the stronger part.
Okay.
Easy to include a lot of things.
Cool. All right. Yeah, most of the time, at least, the main reason why I like doing this talk is because I've run into CMSs, usually because I'm a consultant, it's CMSs that have been selected by the client, and then it's usually a very painful experience because it's not, it doesn't run on Java, or if it runs on Java, then it's some sort of archaic ant-based build or something like that. It's a pain to work with. So this isn't really a heavily pitched talk towards saying you should use this system. This is kind of just talking about some of the things you can do with this system and how it kind of makes your life a little bit easier. Yeah, but I'll get into that a little bit later. I just wanted to get the temperature before we even get started. As for myself, I'm missing part of my slide because it just reformatted on the fly on me. All right. My name is David Drake. I'm a developer at Dev9. For the past since 1996, I've been in the tech world with a few gaps, working as a middle school teacher, high school janitor, pizza cook, coffee bean hauler, and doing a lot of QA testing. So you'll see a lot about how to test things as they move through the life cycle in here. It's kind of an infected mind kind of mentality there. I'm also Hippo CMS trained. I went through their development course out in Boston. Pretty nice people. Especially because when they take you through the training, they actually do it with some of the engineers who work on the product, on developing it, or work very, very closely with them. So as a result, you're not just getting a trainer who knows a deck, which I don't know if you've ever been through that, but that's not a very fun class. I work at Dev9. Malia has already given a very good description of what Dev9 is and what we do. We build custom software solutions, and we're very focused on continuous delivery. I like to think that it's because we give really good client results from using continuous delivery, but honestly, it's just a lot more fun to work that way and a lot easier. Those are some of our typical projects, including CMS implementation, Java, SQL, NoSQL, etc. You can read. So what I'm going to talk to you about real quickly is an intro to Hippo. Hippo, being a CMS system, has a kind of a huge product. It has lots and lots of features, so I'm not really going to be able to show you everything that it does or do it any kind of justice, really, as far as what all it can do. And because I've only, we're going to give a quick overview of what we mean by continuous delivery in the first place. Then we're going to run through some of those interesting bits of what I think makes a good continuous delivery pipeline: testing, building, releasing, deploying, monitoring, and then last of all, dealing with the thorniest issue when you're talking about deploying a CMS, and that's how do you handle content. And that's where things are getting a little bit more interesting. So if you hang on to the end, that's where things get thorny, and then you guys can throw in maybe your ideas on the subject too. That's the deal. So start with Hippo CMS. About a few months ago, the CTO of our company, Will Iverson, went through basically an evaluation because the CMS market is clogged with lots and lots and lots of different products. We were trying to look at something that we could actually recommend to clients when they came to us, because we would keep running into situations where we were dealing with very, very clunky CMS systems. So he looked at basically what kind of CMS would be easy for us as Java developers to work with. Can a dev build it? Can you test it easily? Is it easy to upgrade? How expensive is it? Et cetera, et cetera. How do you manage the configuration? And basically looking for which of these could fit into the kind of development that we like to do, the kind of development that is fun and simple. Amongst the top two that came out of that was Hippo CMS for a few reasons. One of them is that we're a Java development shop for the most part, and it's Java-based. It's open source. You can actually use the open source version for free. It's very, very easy to try out. All you have to do is just grab the Maven archetype and build the instructions on their website, work like a charm. And it runs on Java 8, so it's at least using pretty recent technology. It's extensible because it is open source. You can dig in there and add things to it. It has a nice modular architecture in that you can pull bits and pieces in and out as you need to. It follows open standards. It's basically following the JCR 170 spec, which is implemented in the Apache Jackrabbit project, which is basically the content repository for Java specification. So that's an open API. But it also has lots of fancy features, so it's not, it's not a bargain basement tool. It's very, very feature rich. It includes the ability to have targeted content based on personas that you build up for the user as they move through your site. It can integrate with lots of different backends. They even have a hosted offering to make it easier for deployment. It's very feature rich. I'm going to go over the architecture real quick, just because for the rest of the presentation I'm going to be opening things up. Yeah?
What was in the second place that was not chosen?
Second place that was not chosen. We also looked at Bright Spot. That was another one that was that we were looking at. Yeah. So the architecture here, because I'm going to be showing bits and pieces of this, so I'm going to give you this kind of as a map before we get in. Down here in the center, this content repository. When I say Apache Jackrabbit, that's here. The content repository is at the heart of it, and it links together the authoring tools and the delivery tools, which are basically separate platforms. The cool thing about Hippo for me as a backend developer is that I think content is just data, right? So why am I storing this as HTML or pages or whatever? And that's how Hippo has it organized. The content repository treats it all as data in a node structure hierarchy. So how you present it might change depending upon what channel you're targeting. If I just treat it as data, then maybe I can just make a RESTful endpoint and pull that out, and then I can use that on a mobile platform. Or maybe I do want to push it through a free marker template or JSP, or up through Angular JS API, whatever I want to do. Because the content is separated from the method of delivery, it gives you a lot of flexibility. And that's one thing that I like being a back-end developer, because that means I don't have to worry too much about how it's going to get out there at the end. The authoring tool and the delivery tool are both, you reach them through a browser client, so there's no local install, for instance. And those can be hosted on the same site, or they can be separated out into multiple sites, depending upon how you want to set up your firewalls, for example. That's the basic overview, and now I'm going to give a real quick demo of what it looks like. Over here in my project, they actually ships out with a profile. cargo.run, which is a cargo profile that just fires everything up and runs it locally, right out of the box. Fingers crossed and all that. But, sir.
Could you explain what cargo is?
Sure. Everybody, who's used cargo? Oh, yeah. I knew I should have asked that. You guys use Maven? A lot of you? Yeah, shaking your heads. Yeah. So cargo is a tool that happens to have a Maven plugin, but it actually is. I think you can hook it up with Ant or almost anything else. It's a kind of a container for containers. So you can configure cargo to say, I want you to pull down Jetty and then run this war. Or I want you to pull down Tomcat and I want you to run these 3 wars on these 3 context paths. So it's kind of like your Maven Tomcat plugin, except on steroids, for better or worse. Like if I was just going to target Tomcat, I'd probably just use the Maven Tomcat plugin. But if you need a little bit more flexibility, then you can use cargo. So what cargo does in this case is it orchestrates pulling all the separate wars, because there is a separate war for the authoring side, the site, versus the authoring side, the CMS, versus the site. Pulls all those together, puts them on the correct context paths, makes sure all the libraries are in the right locations, and then fires it up. And it does this without any configuration on my part, which is great, because it actually is kind of a complicated bit of configuration they do. So I'm going to start by showing the little test site that I've got, which is, let's see, right here. All right. So I made a little site for SeaJUG, the Seattle Java Abusers Group, by just kind of modifying their base level content. And I've got some news here. And got a little bit of content over here. So just a wonderful little site that we can explore together.
We've been using those sites.
So this is the CMS front end. By default, it just comes with your typical admin password. Yeah, well, you can hook it up to whatever authentication framework you want to.
Nice.
So here from the dashboard, I can see a list of all the different things that I've been adding to this site, like my wonderful jagged graphic there. If I go down the channels here, I can see if I had multiple different channels, like mobile or for a different language website, I could add them all listed out here as channels. But this is a very, very simple demo. And down here is my content. If I was a content author, this is the interface that I would use for adding new content. For instance, those news items, which are organized by date down here. This one here on inner classes, if I wanted to change this, I could edit it here and save and close. By doing this, it says that a previous version is live, so that means that this change is not yet live on the site. If I want to make it live, then I can publish it. But basically this, because I'm an admin, I can do both of those things. If you were just an editor, then you would basically review other people's changes and publish them. If you were just a content author, then you could make changes and then wait for an editor to actually choose to publish them. So that's part of the workflows that can be set up, and that can be customized. But if I want to, what I can do before I even put it live is preview it, and I can see what the change will look like. So I will go back to editing this, or not, right here, and choose to publish it, and that'll take it live on the actual site. You can also, basically all of these content types you can dynamically edit in here. You don't want to do this too often, obviously, because remember that this content, once it goes out live on your production site, that content is going to be having a particular structure. So if you change that structure, you kind of have to think of it as a database migration. So you want to set it up and make changes that are backwards compatible rather than trying to modify things on the fly. They also have reporting, admin features, all of this stuff through this interface. But under the hood, what it's actually talking to is a Jackrabbit repository. And you can see that by going to the console, and that's where you get the hairy view of what's actually going on underneath. Right here. So basically, all of the site configuration and all of the content is stored here in a node structure. So if I look here under content, Hip Demo, News 2015-06, then I'll see all these nodes for all of the content that I've been working on here. And under each one of these, you'll actually see that there are 3 different versions of it. The version that's currently being edited, the version that's waiting to be published, and the version that's currently live. So you can actually see each one of those and possibly expose them in different areas. So not only is the content stored in here, but also all of the site configuration. So basically what channels you're using, what host you're targeting, etc. Now it also ships out of the box with this Essentials package. And when I say that it's a modular design, a lot of the modules that you can install are available here. They're served up actually by cargo, so I can go into the library and choose that if I want to add new features, I can take a look at the different features that are available, click on this install feature, if I want to install FAQs, for example, and then it will add those dependencies, add the necessary classes, make the changes to your project structure in order to add that in, and then tell you need to do a rebuild. Yeah?
I was just wondering, so how does the Jackrabbit live compatibly with, for example, Spark, if you're like in a distributed cluster environment?
If you're in a distributed cluster environment?
Yeah, and do you have to, like you're managing your SQL, do you have to open a different port or something, or can you just piggyback your content directly?
The Jackrabbit repository can be backed. Actually, it's configurable as to what kind of data source you put behind it. So you can put, like when it's over here, it's just using like an in-memory on the file, like H2 sort of database behind it. But you can configure it to connect to different kinds of databases. So for that, it would just be whatever your database configuration is.
So theoretically, I was just trying, what's the amenity? Theoretically, you run in the JVM, right? So theoretically, if you were trying to do Drupal or Joomla and just run your JVM services in the background, this advantage would be that it's faster, plugs in directly to Tomcat. I mean, are there some selling points?
It's just I'm not sure why it would run in parallel with those, because it is a content repository.
I'm saying to choose this over
Okay.
the existing content management packages. So
The difference is if you are say a Java shop, one thing is that it's written in Java. It's open source, so you're able to easily modify it, extend it, and also because it treats all of the content in it as data, which makes it easier to access as opposed to thinking of content as pages, for example, which is helpful when you're trying to push the same content out through multiple channels.
So it's on that editor, you have kind of like a WYSIWYG editor. How does it store like annotated markup?
How does it store the annotated markup? Yeah, it does have a, in the editor, it has basically a rich text editor. So it has built into it the ability to store different kinds of markup, and then it handles the whitelisting, the translation on in the HST component filters for getting those in and out. But yeah, because of that, it's able to handle translating markup up into the page. I think there might be examples of it in here, actually. If I take a look at this, then if I edit it, yeah, so you can see here, basically it's kind of like that, like a Jira template. You can see which styles are going to be supported by the page here.
Question?
Yep.
So there was a hint that does something about links. That's a word for broken links.
Mhm.
So how handles the linkages between pieces of content? So for example, if I refer from one news article to another, or to some other piece of content.
Yeah, Hippo does track those links. As far as how it does that under the covers, I'd have to get back to you on that. But because that is one of the definitely the more tricky technical bits, especially because when you're creating templates, for example, you have to actually use they have a special tagging library that they use in order to set up the links for your CSS, for your images, etc. But because of that, it handles all the URL rewriting that might happen for different kinds of displays views for your site. Because the same content might be displayed in lots of different contexts. So as a result, you need to find a good way to find a canonical link to it. Anyway, one more.
And what will happen if content moves?
If content moves, yeah, that's part of how you set up the canonical links for it in the site settings. Basically, each piece of content has a canonical location on the site path. So if you do have a link to it, then it's going to go to that canonical location.
Yeah, I guess if you hit the link there in the editor, it's should be offering you the internal pages. So you insert something that is a mark to this page. So if it moves, it's gonna follow it. Should be. That's what.
Yeah.
The expectation.
That's what I'm looking for. For example, Confluence does that.
Okay.
But with the
I think it's a
different
basic.
versioning they're trying to implement, I'm wondering how that is working. Is it scheduled to be published? Is it immediately live?
Immediately live, actually. So when you, the way that the CMS is designed is such that you're doing your authoring and your site delivery on the same repository. So when you're editing it, you're editing against the exact same repository as the live repository. So when you publish it, it's immediate. It's just changing basically which node is being displayed out into the live content. I know that there's a lot of...
Talking about move, let's say if I move this piece of content, then it might be linked to another place.
Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to get back to you on that. Yeah. So that's very, very high level overview because what it does is kind of just getting us in the door to talk about how you actually start delivering this thing. All right. So as far as continuous delivery principles, what we're talking about when we talk about continuous delivery, I kind of think of it as a platonic ideal. It's a state that I rarely ever actually get to on a client site because usually we're in a transformational engagement, moving folks from a state of, a different state than the target. But basically what we're talking about is finding a way to get new business features out to the public as quickly as possible with as little manual steps and making it happen reliably, consistently, without having to be basically the every 6 months you all stay up all night over the weekend and try to deploy. And the way that we do that, well, kind of the groundwork there, I think, is automated testing, starting with unit testing and then all the way up through the stack. You have to make sure that what you have still works as intended, all the way up through to production with each handoff. Automated testing then needs to be able to run in a consistent environment, so that's why we use continuous integration servers to keep running those builds in a continuous fashion, as close to what our target environment is going to look like. We have simple, repeatable deployments, preferably without any kind of downtime. Throughout this entire process, we need to make sure that it's highly visible to all stakeholders so that everyone knows what state a piece is in. Oh, wait, what's going out today? Or getting confused over trying to find the change log for what bugs and features actually are in production. And throughout all this, as much as possible, reduce manual steps because if I do something twice, I'm going to do it different the second time. I will foul things up every time. So if I can get it done in a repeatable fashion and forget about it, that's ideal. And even better than that is getting it done in a repeatable fashion that anyone can understand when they have to pick it up after I leave. Just getting it automated is not good enough. Right, Phil? Because Phil's had to pick up some stuff that I left. Sorry, Phil. So here's an overview of what this dev pipeline kind of looks like with Hippo. And for most of this is kind of generic, your generic Java delivery pipeline. In that you start with your developer instance, you commit code up through, say, Git, whatever your code repository is. That gets pulled into your CI tool, your Jenkins, Bamboo, TeamCity, etc. which will then trigger your build tool, in this case, most likely Maven, Gradle, Ant, which runs your automated test suite. If it's successful, then it's going to release into your binary repository. That's your Nexus, Artifactory, etc., Docker registry. And from there, it'll get pulled into your deployment environments, your staging, live, QA, dev, whatever environments you have set up. From there, the content is delivered across different channels, desktop, mobile, native mobile. And then there's this other funny flow at the back, which I've already been warning you about, and that's that purple side where content flows back from production into the earlier environments. Because content authoring happens in production. We don't want to make adding a new piece to the site a deployment. You don't want your content authors to be trying to stick things into an IDE. It needs to be immediate. But as a result of that, that means that what's happening in production, your most important target data, has to find a way to get back into earlier locations so we can make sure that it doesn't screw everything up. So we'll talk a little bit about some strategies for dealing with that. So I'm going to start with talking about testing stages. Remember that I spent a long time doing testing, so for me this is the most exciting bit. Anybody else really excited about testing? All right, yeah. So we start off in the build with unit tests and functional tests. Our unit tests are testing each unit of code, but I'd like to make sure that inside our build we're also doing functional testing. That means firing up the site without any third-party dependencies, with mocked-out third-party dependencies, or with temporary ones, what have you, and then running tests against it as though we're live. If that succeeds, then we can say, all right, this is good enough to release, because it passes at least our basic standards of quality. Once it's deployed, then we can run our smoke test against it, make sure that it actually came up. If it does, then we can verify by running our system integration tests. Now that we're in a more realistic environment, we can replace all those fake dependencies with real dependencies and see if things still work. We're checking all of our assumptions at that point. Then we can start over again. So digging in on the unit testing side, because this framework, the only parts of code that you're actually going to be writing are likely going to be templates for what those pages look like. If you are using free marker templates or JSPs or what have you, you may be adding custom HST components. HST components, which are like Hippo Site Tools components. I think that's what they use for that acronym. But basically, if you're adding new components for how data gets delivered up through the site, or if you're adding new beans that surface content out through REST APIs, for example, for those, you're going to want to write unit tests for those. And then any front-end code, if you do have a separate set of front-end code, if you're running like AngularJS or what have you, then they'll have a separate unit testing framework associated with that. Those are different layers where you may want to write unit tests. Now with the templates, it's a little bit tricky, naturally. For me, I'm a little bit iffy on this as to whether we should wait for functional testing for something like a free marker template. But if you are doing something like looping and conditionals, if you're doing data logic on those, then it makes sense to try to get those rendered before you even get them up into the site. To kind of treat that template as data, since you are doing data manipulation inside of it. And there are some interesting ways to do that, using like embedded Jetty servers to fire up the free marker processors that one can do. For the HST components, they provide, Hippo actually provides a mocking library built in, because that's actually one of the more complicated bits. And you can kind of see this here. So there's a banner object on the site right now, and that's basically, it's got an image and it's got some text underneath it. This is the bean that actually gets displayed. Let me.
More annotations than code.
Yeah, lots of annotations because there's a lot of XML processing going on in how Hippo displays it. But all of this code is generated. Basically, when I create the content, create the document type inside the CMS editor interface, then it builds these beans for me. So I don't have to write these annotations, so I can kind of forgive them for that, almost. This same bean can get displayed using this banner resource down here. And if you guys have used Jaxer's library, then this looks pretty darn familiar. This is how you can expose that same banner component. And I actually didn't build this code either. Using the Essentials plugin, you can actually say, for this document type, create a RESTful endpoint for it. And it generates this for me automatically. It doesn't look exactly like how I would design a RESTful endpoint. Like, I don't really care about pagination if I'm just thinking of this as raw data. But basically, I can take this and extend it, modify it, and make it into whatever I want it to do. I might decide that I don't necessarily want to support XML. I just want to push out JSON, for example. So you can take this and edit it, but it gives you a good starting point and wires it in. So if I wanted to write unit tests for this, I see that there's actually this funny inherited method here, find beans, which actually is reaching back into all the servlet context. So they provide a nice extension of the EasyMock library. Any of you guys use EasyMock? Is it any good? I haven't used it outside of this context. There's shaking his head, yeah. Yeah. So if I take a look at this banner resource test over here, you can see that they provide a mock HST request object. This is basically the request object that would come into here, rather than trying to build all this myself and figure out all the different crazy components that they have, because they actually are, they use the request to track personas. There's a lot of context information that comes in with it. Rather than dealing with that, I can just create a new mock HST request, use the mock builder to mock out the find beans method, which is inherited from the parent, so I don't really care that much about using it. Set up my expectations, and then verify it here, and make sure that I'm actually getting back the banner resource that I expect to get back from the find beans method. In this case, obviously it's a really trivial example, because if I look back at the amount of code that I actually had in the resource, I'm testing this here. So not that exciting, but you kind of get the idea. They have a mocking library that helps you get away from all the nasty bits of the system underneath if you need to.
Is Banner, is this a plugin or a component, or is this like the built-in functionality of?
Built-in.
What about plugins? Are there any blocks available for that? Like, what was the existing strategy around that, or is it only just the built-in stuff? CMS?
The built-in stuff, yeah. I guess if you add plugins, then you would need to have your own mocking strategy for those. Yeah. All right. So for functional tests, what we're talking about there is actually verifying any custom additions to the CMS, or verifying any configuration of the sitemap, or if you're talking about testing the functional interface that you create on the site. Like if you have a login form on your site, or if you want to make sure that you can go to the news content and see that these news content items are sorted in the manner that you thought appropriate, this is where you would have functional tests. If you're designing this more as a REST API, then you might use REST assured to test against that. If you're actually testing against the site, Selenium. And the golden rule with Selenium is to use it as little as possible. But if you do have to use it, if you actually do buy their license, then it comes with the QA Essentials package, which is actually kind of neat. I'll show you a little bit of that over here. Because what it does is it provides a Cucumber-based kind of BDD-style template with a lot of the page objects already built into it, so that you don't have to go through the work for the CMS site, for example. There's a lot. That CMS site is going to have a lot of very similar components in between all of your different deployments. It's going to have a lot of the same channel mapping and what have you. So you can just use their built-in page objects for that instead. So got a bit of it over here under func test. You guys used Cucumber before? Okay, some of you, yeah. So this is basically straight out of their template. These scenarios here. If we go over to the steps behind the scenes, this CMS main page, test context, get CMS page factory. These are all nice utility methods that are provided by them to build out the page objects without me having to build all the page objects that supports all this. For actually running this, however, it's possible to you can modify the existing cargo template. What I actually did for testing out running this was taking this and throwing it into a Docker container, because that was actually a lot easier to spin up and down than cargo. I'll get a little bit later to showing what that cargo file looks like. For now, I can try to actually show those tests running to see what that looks like. At the grave risk of trying to do a Selenium demo. So in the background, what it's done is it's fired up a Docker container which contains the site in Tomcat. Because the site is just now loading up inside of a fresh new Docker container, it's going to spin for a little while. But once the site comes up, it's going to log into the CMS, open up the channel perspective, and then verify that it's on the right page. Then it's going to go over to another perspective and make sure that it's on the right page there and verify that. And then it comes out with a nice report at the end if everything works right. When presenting, it's always a little bit more dicey because I'm always afraid it's going to capture my mouse in Firefox and foul up the test. But not today. So then if I come back over here, I see my 2 scenarios passed, all 7 steps passed. And these are fun. This is nice because I didn't have to do any configuration at all on this package. Just pulled it out, pointed it at my site, and was working right away. That's one of the nice things. They have pretty good quality on the components that they delivered. So with functional tests running, then I can start thinking about the next layer up. That's going to be smoke tests. Perfect. Basically verifying that the site is up, you can talk to its dependencies. And for this, you might talk to the monitoring endpoints. Smoke test. A good smoke test should be very, very fast. You're not actually testing site functionality. It's just the site thinks it's up, as far as I'm concerned. After that, then we talk about a layer of system integration tests. So once Hippo is deployed, it may have a lot of different external dependencies that it's talking to. I haven't met a client yet that just says, I just want a CMS. It's always, I already have an e-commerce package, and I want a CMS that can talk to this e-commerce package. Or I have this product catalog, and I want to be able to talk to that. An ontology tool, for example. Once you're fired up in your actual environment, you need to be able to test that those integrations are functional by running kind of a subset of those, those functional tests. Except running actually end-to-end through the API all the way to the back end, making sure that we can make the full round trip successfully. And for this, it's an even smaller subset of tests because these are going to be very difficult to maintain, especially with all the timing of running from end to end. But these are the kind of the critical ones, the ones that I really want to run at least once a day, maybe even once an hour to make sure that my back end is all still wired together and working. So much for testing. Next up, building. So when you build this project, we map those out to maven lifecycle phases. So all those tests get run every single time that you build for the unit test and functional tests, and every time you deploy, your smoke test and your system integration tests. Out of the box, Hippo builds into a tar, and this is configurable, but in that tar you'll have the site layer, the CMS layer, and also a bunch of bootstrap layer. And the bootstrap is basically all of the content that you see in that repository is kind of outside of the code. So as you are editing it in your development environment, it gets serialized off into the bootstrap package so that you can choose to run that, basically unwind that bootstrap to set up your entire environment whenever you deploy it. Now, in some cases, that isn't really appropriate. If you're deploying into production and you've already got a bunch of production content out there, you don't want your bootstrap to override it. So basically, whether or not you use the bootstrap is supplied with a system parameter when you fire up the system. But this whole thing is actually pretty easily wrapped in Docker. They have some good examples online. I'll show you what the Docker file for this looks like, because it's actually kind of simple. You guys are all using Docker, I assume. It seems like that's what all the kids are using these days. Like a little nod in their head. Only in test projects, I'm guessing.
You say the kids.
Yeah. Anyone here actually using Docker in production? One. Java 6 and Docker? All right.
That's how
That's exactly what they use.
Okay. So when I say a pretty simple Docker file, I mean it fits on one screen. Here it is. Basically, all you're doing is you're untarring the tar that is built using the dist profile for the project. And then you have to do a little bit of modifications to the Tomcat container in order to support shared libraries, because it doesn't do that by default anymore, apparently. A feature that I didn't even know existed. But in order to reduce the size of the deployable, there's some shared libraries between the authoring side and the site side. So they put those into a shared location. And then from there, it fires up just using the generic Tomcat 8 JRE8. And that's what I just used to run those functional tests. So when you release, the question then becomes, are you going to release a tar or are you going to release a Docker image? Whichever one is appropriate to your context, depending upon what you're planning to release. If you're using a tar, then you can store that in your binary repository just fine. If you're going to be releasing a Docker image, maybe it's your Docker registry. Or maybe you've got your maven repository configured as a Docker registry, which I understand is a thing you can do. But that should be pretty straightforward. As far as deployment, then whatever deployment orchestration you're using communicates with the target environment, telling it to pull down from the binary repository, and it makes any necessary configuration changes to it. If it's your Docker registry, pulling that Docker image down and just running Docker up on it. If it is instead the tar distribution, then you're unloading it into the Tomcat directory and expanding it there. But all of that is really straightforward because there's not much to the actual deployment, which is one of the things I love about this. I've messed with some packages that have really, really complicated deployment processes where you have to run updates on them and what have you. You have to do a full install before you can do anything else. But this is very straightforward. It should be very familiar to anyone who's done any other kind of Java deployment, any or here sort of thing. So that's nice. That's why that slide is so simple. But deploying it locally is not really the only option. Again, I mentioned that Hippo actually has an on-demand offering. For that means you don't have to bother with hosting it. You don't have to bother with setting up your site. And they've got it all set up according to Hippo's best practices. Basically, what they recommend that you set up in your dev environments, they have it all up on AWS for you, where you just have to throw the tar in and they give you monitoring and support and all that kind of thing. And that's actually what their recommended setup is. Firewalls in between each layer, a separate load balancer, web proxy, separate delivery and authoring, and then finally the database in the end. So now that we're talking about deployment, the next phase is how do you reduce downtime for that deployment? Because if I am expanding that WAR out there, then obviously that means I'm shutting down Tomcat or blowing it up or something. Even if I am just trying to switch Docker containers. What they recommend is using a load balancer switchover from with blue-green environments. So the way that starts is you first of all replicate the database over, then install by exploding out your package. Once you make sure that it's up, then you can do a switchover from your load balancer. The only tricky bit here is that means that for a little while, you need to do a content freeze on this side in order to prevent new data from being lost when you do the switchover. They talk a little bit about how to do that on the Hippo site. You can do it by basically disabling all CMS privileges for a little while before you start the delivery, or they have a tool that can be used to synchronize so that you can actually reduce that freeze time by tracking the changes that pile up in the intermediate time and then applying those on the new database. But I like this method because that actually means that I can have however much time I have here with this new production site. It's not just making sure that it starts up. I can also, if I want to, run some acceptance tests against it to make sure that not only is it up, that it's actually working. That's kind of a last-ditch check.
So you can finally test in production without getting fired.
With a copy production, yeah. So, as far as monitoring, this is one piece where I wasn't able to find too much more than that they actually have a ping servlet built in that'll at least give you a 200, 500 response based upon whether or not it can come back to the JCR repository and make a round trip. For me, that's not enough because I'm also worried about all my external dependencies. But because it's an open framework, it's extensible. So I assume that I can modify this endpoint and add in whatever checks I need for any other external dependencies that I might have. What I'd really love to do, though, is try to find a way to get actuator wired in there. And it, by the way, is using Spring 4 for its dependency management, incidentally. Now, for monitoring, it also has one kind of neat feature. Have you guys used profiling tools before on your applications? What profiling tools have you used? Yeah. JProfiler, yeah. Anything else?
Visual PM.
Yeah. So one of the nice things a lot of those will provide is they'll give you a breakdown if you go into a thread as far as how long it took a particular task to execute and where it spent all that time. And that's actually built into Hippo. They have page diagnostics that you can enable or disable, because obviously if you do have this enabled, then it's going to create massive logs. So if I go back to the site, over here I'll show you what that kind of looks like. And back up. Fire up the server. What it does when it adds these diagnostics is it logs out how long each request takes, and it shows a breakdown for where it's spending the time, which classes it's actually spending time in for each step along the way, which is great for trying to do performance diagnosis. But obviously you wouldn't want to have that turned on all the way in production, or you'd just blow up your hard drive. But they had filtering to it so that you can actually filter down to say, I only want to look at traffic for these IP addresses, on the one hand. Or you can add filtering to say, I actually only want to look at requests that are taking longer than, say, 5 seconds. And then it'll only print out those. In which case I started thinking, maybe I could actually probably use that if I actually had a customer complaint and just look for, okay, turn it on for anything that's running over 10 seconds and see if we can find out where it's causing that trouble. So, and if I go to the site, remember what the site is, take a look at this content item. Back over here, I can see the breakdown for all of this. With my screen blown out, it doesn't line up very nicely because of the sizing. You can see it coming in at the top, pipeline processing at 874 milliseconds, and then the milliseconds as it goes through each one of those components. That's kind of nice. So flipping back, I think now we're to the really hairy part. And that's content. Content is terrible. It messes everything up. If you've done database migrations, you know what I'm talking about. In that whatever content you thought you were going to be testing with, whatever's in production looks nothing like it. Whatever they said was going to be a Boolean field, they're actually storing like red or 3000 or what have you. Or maybe you thought that they were always going to put the date in there because you thought that date was required, but no, the content authors, they just left the date off the whole time. So when you add a feature that relies on that, suddenly your system dies. Content testing is kind of critical. In addition, maybe you are developing this cool new feature, but you actually require some new fields on every piece of content in production. So what do you do about that when you deploy it? What happens when it tries to find that and sees that the node structure is completely different? So I'm going to talk about those two topics real quick. First of all, talking about how we can test changes to the configuration. So for the configuration of the site, like if you have changes to the sitemap or how your searches are set up, what have you, there's actually a JCR patch tool that you can reach from the console. So in the console, you can just say, take this one and show me all the changes that have happened to it ever since it was bootstrapped. We'll print that out into an XML patch, including everything with your moves, deletes, and what have you. And then you can export that and then apply it into an earlier environment. Now that's obviously a the disadvantage of that is that's a manual process. You actually have to go into the console, click on the node, make the patch, run it back, and then replay it. But it can be useful if, say, during developments you want to check on one particular feature of the site and run some tests against it. Once you've done that, then it gets added to that Bootstrap content, so every other developer will then be able to test against it. Now, as far as for content itself, for ad hoc testing, you can do something similar in that you go to one of those nodes in the repository. You can say, give me an XML export of everything from this node down. It will pull that out into an XML file, and then you can take that and import it into your repository. The difference there being that in this case, it's not a diff. It's not going to look for, it's not a patch. It doesn't look for how things have been moved or deleted. It's just going to put it there and give it new UIDs for that new location. So if you have a bunch of content, like all the news from the month of December, you can export it and then pull that into your dev environment and use that as test content from that point on. Again, that's a pretty manual process, but it would be applicable if I was as a developer, I was wanting to basically create a new feature that relied on the structure of the content. I mean, export some production content, bring it in, and make sure that it's in all my test instances. A more holistic strategy, though, is basically to kind of use that same strategy you use for the blue-green deployment and create an entire copy clone of the production repository to do your testing against. So maybe this is your UAT environment. Whenever you do a deployment there, first thing you do is copy off all the content from production into it, make any necessary changes using setup scripts to modify it to suit the target environment, and you can automate that as part of your deployment process out to it, and then run your acceptance tests against it. By doing that, you're basically testing out your production deployment before you have to hit the production environment, which is much, much better if you've ever run through one of those deployments where you're testing for the first time against production content. So as far as, that's kind of 3 different strategies to get there. As far as which one you want to use, it really depends upon what your purposes are. If you are wanting to modify the content, or if you have a new feature that relies heavily on the structure of the content, you're going to want to make sure you have very, very realistic content back in your dev machine. So doing that manual content export using a JCR patch is the way to go. And depending upon the security of that content, maybe you do have to go through a scrubbing process in the middle there. But the repository clone, though, is basically this is the your actual level of security. If your acceptance test pass against a clone of that production repository with all of its content, all of its structure, all of its site maps, then you've got a reasonable assurance that your live production deployment is going to go smoothly. And that's especially important when you start doing something hairy with the content, like doing a content structure change. So if you are changing your content, if you're adding on new things, subtracting things, that's what this picture is meant to kind of embody thematically there, then the application actually supports Groovy updater scripts. So there's an update editor built into the CMS that lets you create scripts that can traverse those JCR nodes and make the necessary changes on startup, so that before the content ever gets live to anyone else, it automatically can make those transformations that are necessary. Basically, like if you've used My Baddest Migrations or Flyway, for example, it's that kind of idea. To design them well, obviously you'd want to make it idempotent such that if it runs once and runs again, then it's not going to make duplicate changes. But also so that if you are using that synchronization feature, where you create a clone, you migrate all the content using these updater scripts, and then after the synchronization, you get new content just before you go live, then you want to be able to rerun those updater scripts on that diff content in order to bring those up to standards too. That kind of makes sense? All right, that's like one of the trickiest bits there, and that's also why you want to be pulling that content earlier into your dev environment or into a UAT environment, so you can be testing all of those updater scripts against real content before it ever hits prod. So that you can make sure that those translations are going to work effectively. And that's the last little bit. So at this point I can say, any questions? Yeah?
Is there an ingest bit of Hippo where you could say pull content from a third party, like a feed, an MRSS feed or watch folders to auto-populate content with Hippo?
There are lots of, because it's open, there are lots of ways to integrate with different systems in Hippo. So one place to look to see what integration is already built in is to go to onehippo.org, and they have a lab section where they show some sample integrations with different features. Like they have a good mobile lab. I've got a lab up there for integrating with Swagger UI. Yeah. But I'm not sure off the top of my head with that particular one. Yeah.
Could you explain why I would need to rebuild the Hippo thing all the time? So, for example, I would use the database, but I would never recompile the database.
You don't. You only really need to do the build when you're making changes to the base project. If all you're doing is adding content and displaying new content and what have you, then you're doing that all in production, live, you're just fine. It's when you decide that you're wanting to create a new site template, like a new free market template. And that's a nice feature actually that I didn't even show, is actually that when you've got cargo running back there, it's automatically reloading any free market templates you added. So it's kind of doing your JRebel type work for you. Or CSS changes, for example, it's automatically watching the file system and loading those up for you. Kind of nice there. But that's the only reason why you would is if you're adding on new dependencies, if you're adding on new external connections, new features to the site overall. If all you're doing is content, then yeah, you don't need to build.
So if I'm creating a component, let's say I would love to embed from time to time to my articles.
Mhm.
Maybe it's some spinner banner that shows something. I don't need to build Hippo. I can do it just by what?
Well, if you are just adding new content to the site, like new images, text, resources like that,
Let me explain. So go back to your VisiVig editor for content. Okay? I would love to be able to embed a component that will show something. Now, let's say I could specify some query parameters for that component, and that component will draw the actual content from another section of the repository. So
Yeah,
how
they-
can I create such a component? How can I make that available for the visiting editor so the content editors can use this component in their content?
Yeah, you absolutely can. They have basically an API for building components that can then be dragged and dropped around inside of the page design in the WYSIWYG editor. So the editor allows you to do the content editing, so you can add new bits of content, but it also has in the channel selector, if you have created drag and drop components, then you can add them or remove them from the site. There's just a little bit more development on that side in order to make those reusable bits. But they have labs for that on their site, absolutely.
But then I will need to rebuild the Hippo almost like 9 years.
When you create the components, yeah, you'll need to compile it, build it, distribute it out there. But as far as moving, once it's there, then anyone can add it or remove it from the pages.
But I cannot have a content that I write there, the free marker code, and then I can call from other places. I can insert it in other pages.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, so the answer is if you do it in free marker, you don't need to build it. It's the component. If it's done with free marker, you don't need to build, right?
Yes. Well, I mean, it would be built into the site, but yeah.
If you make it in Java, then
I don't care if it's Java or non-Java. I'm just wondering how custom components can be added to the visiting editor and how custom editors for those components can be created.
Yeah, there's basically if you go to their site, they have a trail and they have a tutorial trail that can go through like how you can create custom components that can then be dragged and dropped around in the interface. It's a little bit outside of like the scope of what I can demo tonight. But once you've got those built into the site, then any content editor can rearrange those components on the page. Basically, you have to configure a template that has space for those components to be dropped in. All right? I don't think you're entirely satisfied. I think that's as far as I can get you.
And beers afterwards.
All right.
yeah. How much it takes the whole pipeline
Deploying, as far as time? Boy, it doesn't take very long to build a distribution at all. I mean, a matter of seconds. I mean, I can show you how long it takes. So from there, it's just a matter of how long does it take to upload to Nexus, how long does it take to download from Nexus, how long does it take Tomcat to start up, you know. So we were talking about minutes, really, but also how long it takes your acceptance test to run.
Yeah, it can be. And then this copy of the database will have another environment. It's not part of the things you make. It's just a recommendation. Or?
That's Hippo's recommendation, is cloning the database. Basically, you're creating a backup and then you're firing up your new site on that backup.
But that's what you actually do.
That's what?
That's what you are actually doing.
That's their recommendation as far as their best practice for deployment. I mean, one could just take one site down and deploy the new site on it and then take it back up. A little bit more risk involved in that and a little more downtime.
How good is the documentation in Hippo?
Really good. I've been pretty happy. Their site is quite extensive in that they have lots of examples of what they talk about, and they also have labs that have code up on GitHub. And if you talk to their engineers, they're very responsive, although they are mostly in the Netherlands, so it may be a day. Yeah.
Do you know if they're moving, if they're looking at oak at all?
I would almost guarantee that they are, because a lot of the Hippo, a lot of them are big contributors to Jackrabbit. So there's definitely a feedback loop there between Hippo and Jackrabbit. So as new releases come out there, I'm sure that they're going to be folding them back in. Anything else?
So, with regards to, could you speak to a little bit more detail about like maybe some of the dynamic content aspects of Hippo? And I'm sorry if I missed that part of the presentation. But like for example, if you want to customize the content for certain types of people and things like that, so dynamic content generation, is that typically REST APIs, the server content that they get integrated with like your website or something like that, or how is that?
As far as content that is tailored to a particular person as they come into the site, Hippo does actually track the user as they come through the site. And that's tracked through basically their personas plugin. It's part of their enterprise features, but that's basically configured through the same CMS system. You can present different content to a person depending upon, based upon certain thresholds you can set for what their usage activity looks like. Yeah.
Okay. And what about defining workflows within Hippo itself? Is there like a UI for that, or like how do you typically have it? So you want to have some approvals along the way or something like that. Is there flexibility in being able to create stuff like that?
One can modify the workflows, and I think there are plugins that support extra modifications of the workflow beyond the base one. The base one being that you have content creators and you have editors, and people create content, and the editors are the ones who publish it. It does have role-based security, so you can apply different roles to different people depending upon what approvals you want to give them. Yeah, but yeah, it does. That does fall into another level of customization, and I don't think it's built in. If you want to add new approval steps. What's that?
Say this is even better than library.
That's dark. It's I went through the training for Hippo, and I thought, this is something I could use for projects at home pretty easily. If I wanted to, I could throw up a Hippo site, super simple. That's definitely not the experience that I had working with Liferay. But Liferay is also kind of a different, it has a different purpose. I'm not sure what it is, but. Anything else? No, we're kind of late.
All right, I guess with that, we'll call it a night.
Thank you. You're much better than middle schoolers.
What was that?
Much better than middle schoolers.
Cool, all right, well, if you want to hang out, we're probably going to have for beers here shortly. I guess we'll call it an early night today. So thank you. Have a good night.